The wine glass stopped halfway to his lips. Across the dining room of the most exclusive restaurant in Chicago, a woman stood beside the maître d', her posture straight, her face carrying the quiet strength of someone who had stopped needing permission years ago. Behind her stood a young man, tall and lean, with grey-blue eyes that Nathan Ashford saw every morning in his own mirror. "Hello, Nathan." Her voice carried across 23 years of silence as easily as it carried across the room. "This is Elijah, your son." The crystal flute slipped from Nathan's fingers. It didn't shatter, simply tipped and spilled champagne across the white tablecloth in a slow, spreading stain. Victoria, seated across from him, pressed her napkin to the table instinctively, her eyes darting between Nathan and the strangers who had just rewritten her evening. Nathan couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't do anything but stare at the young man whose bone structure matched his own, whose height and bearing and the particular set of his jaw all testified to a truth Nathan had spent 2 decades refusing to acknowledge. The boy, no, the man, studied Nathan with unsettling calm. There was no anger in his expression, no pleading, just the measured assessment of someone who had prepared himself for this moment and refused to be disappointed regardless of the outcome. "I didn't come for money." Caroline's voice remained steady, the same steadiness Nathan remembered from half a lifetime ago. "I didn't come for revenge. Elijah is graduating from medical school next month. He wanted to meet you, just once, before he begins his residency. I told him the choice was his." Welcome back to another powerful story, my beloved listeners. Kindly tell where you're watching from and what time it is where you're at. If you're new here, prepare for a story of betrayal, unexpected love, and what truly makes a family. Drop everything and listen closely. This tale of heartbreak and redemption might just change how you view love and family forever. The Aurelia occupied the 67th floor of the Lakefront Tower, a building Nathan's private equity firm had partially financed during its construction. The restaurant accepted only 40 diners per evening, each paying a minimum of $800 for the privilege of discretion and an uninterrupted view of Lake Michigan. Tonight was supposed to be a quiet celebration. The engagement announcement would appear in the Tribune Society pages tomorrow morning, confirming what Chicago's elite had suspected for months. Nathan Ashford, founder and CEO of Ashford Capital Partners, valued at $4.2 billion by the most recent accounting, would marry Victoria Sterling, whose luxury real estate developments had transformed 3 city neighborhoods. It was, by every measure that mattered to their world, a perfect match. Now Victoria sat frozen, her champagne untouched, watching her fiancé's carefully constructed composure crumble in real time. "Nathan." She spoke his name like a question, like she was asking who he really was. He didn't answer. He couldn't. The room had narrowed to a single point, to Caroline Prescott standing 15 feet away with the physical proof of everything he had tried to leave behind. The maître d' hovered uncertainly, aware that something significant was happening but unsure how to manage it. Other diners had begun to notice the tableau, conversations faltering as Chicago's most powerful families sensed unfolding drama. "Perhaps we should sit." Caroline's suggestion was practical, not pleading. "You and Elijah could talk. I'll wait at the bar." Nathan found his voice, though it emerged rough and unfamiliar. Yes, please. Sit." Victoria stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor with a sound that drew additional attention. "I think I need some air. I'll take a car home. Call me when you've sorted this out." She gathered her clutch and wrap with the efficient movements of a woman who had learned to exit gracefully from uncomfortable situations. Her heels clicked across the restaurant floor, and Nathan watched her go without protest, understanding that whatever existed between them had just fundamentally changed. Caroline took Victoria's abandoned chair. Elijah sat beside her, and for the first time, Nathan could see them both up close. The resemblance between himself and Elijah was undeniable. But there were traces of Caroline too, in the gentle curve of his mouth, in the thoughtful way he held himself. 23 years. Nathan heard himself speak the words as if from a great distance. "You've been alive for 23 years. 22. Elijah's voice was calm, neither hostile nor warm. "I turned 23 in September." The correction landed like an accusation. Nathan didn't even know his own son's age. A waiter approached tentatively, asking if they needed anything. Caroline declined politely. Nathan couldn't focus enough to respond. The waiter retreated, recognizing that this table required privacy more than service. "Mom said you might not believe us at first." Elijah reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a photograph, sliding it across the stained tablecloth. "But I thought you should see this." Nathan looked down at the image. It showed a younger Caroline, perhaps 30, holding a boy of about 7. The child grinned at the camera with Nathan's exact smile, the same asymmetrical lift at the corner of his mouth that Nathan had inherited from his own mother. His hands trembled as he held the photograph. "I have others." Elijah's tone remained measured. "Every year. Mom documented everything. First steps, first words, first day of school. Birthdays. Graduations. All of it." Nathan understood what Elijah was telling him. Every milestone, every moment that defined a childhood, had been captured and preserved. And Nathan had been absent from all of them. Why now? The question emerged as barely a whisper. After all this time, why now? Caroline answered. "Because he asked. He's been asking about you since he was old enough to understand that other children had fathers and he didn't. I always told him the truth, as much as he could handle at each age. That you weren't ready. That you had made a different choice. I never made you a villain, Nathan. I just told him you weren't there." The simple honesty of her statement cut deeper than any accusation could have. She hadn't needed to poison their son against him. The facts spoke for themselves. "What did you tell him?" Nathan forced himself to meet her eyes. "About what happened between us. That we were young. That we loved each other once. That when I told you I was pregnant, you weren't able to handle it." She paused, and Nathan saw the shadow of old pain cross her face before she composed herself again. "I told him you helped with money when you could." The last sentence confused him. He had never sent money. He had walked away completely, telling himself that a clean break was kindest for everyone. "I never sent money." The words came out before he could stop them. "I didn't know how to reach you. You disappeared." Caroline's expression flickered with something, surprise perhaps, or the reassessment of a story she had told herself for 2 decades. "Then I was mistaken." Her voice remained steady. "We managed without it regardless." The silence that followed was heavy with implication. She had raised their son alone, without financial support, without partnership, without anything from him at all. And she had managed. More than managed, based on the accomplished young man sitting beside her. Medical school. Nathan grasped at the fact like a lifeline. "You're graduating from medical school. Pediatric medicine." Elijah nodded. "I start my residency in July. At Northwestern Memorial. The same hospital where Nathan served on the board. The same institution where he had donated millions to various wings and research programs. His son had been training there, walking the same halls where Nathan occasionally attended fundraising galas, and neither had known. "Your mother said you wanted to meet me." Nathan struggled to find solid ground in this conversation. "Why?" Elijah considered the question carefully before answering. "Because you're half of where I come from. Because I spent my whole childhood imagining who you might be. Sometimes I made you a hero who would come back someday. Sometimes I made you a villain who deserved my anger. The truth is simpler. You're just a person who made a choice. I wanted to see you as a person, not as a story I told myself." The maturity of the response stunned Nathan. This was not an angry child demanding explanations. This was a grown man who had done the emotional work of processing abandonment and emerged with clarity rather than bitterness. "I don't know what to say." Nathan admitted the truth because he had nothing else to offer. "I've spent my whole career knowing exactly what to say in every situation. Negotiations, board meetings, hostile takeovers. I always have the right words. Right now I have nothing. That's honest." Elijah's tone softened slightly. "Honesty is a good place to start." Caroline glanced at her watch. "We should go. Elijah has an early shift tomorrow, and I have patients at 7. She stood, and Elijah rose with her. "But if you want to talk more, Nathan, my number hasn't changed. It's the same one I had 23 years ago." The implication landed. She had kept the same phone number for over 2 decades. If he had ever tried to reach her, he could have. He never tried. They walked toward the restaurant's exit, and Nathan watched them go, paralyzed by the weight of everything he had just learned and everything he still didn't know. At the doorway, Elijah turned back and met his father's eyes across the room. Mom kept every photo, every report card, every piece of evidence of who I became while you were gone. She said someday I might want to show you what you missed. Then they were gone, and Nathan sat alone at a table meant for celebration, surrounded by flat champagne and curious stares, trying to understand how his entire life had just rearranged itself in the space of 20 minutes. The drive home passed in a blur. Nathan's driver, accustomed to silence during evening commutes, said nothing about the early departure or his employer's obvious distraction. The Bentley moved smoothly through Chicago's nighttime traffic, carrying Nathan back to the penthouse he had purchased 3 years ago, when Forbes first estimated his net worth at over $1 billion. The apartment occupied the entire top floor of a building Nathan's firm had developed. 4,000 square feet of polished concrete and floor-to-ceiling windows, decorated by a designer he had met once and never seen again. It was impressive. It was expensive. It was, Nathan realized as he walked through the door, completely empty of anything that mattered. His phone had 17 notifications. 12 were from Victoria, ranging from confused to angry to coldly businesslike. 3 were from his assistant, confirming tomorrow's schedule. 2 were from board members, discussing matters that had seemed important this morning and now felt irrelevant. He ignored all of them. Instead, he walked to the window and stared out at the lake, the same body of water that Caroline and Elijah could see from their home in Evanston. The same water that connected his world to theirs while keeping them completely separate. 23 years. He had built an empire in that time. Ashford Capital Partners had grown from a small investment fund to a global powerhouse, with offices in 12 cities and a portfolio that included real estate, technology, healthcare, and manufacturing. Nathan had been profiled in every major business publication. He had advised senators and testified before congressional committees. He had become, by every metric his industry recognized, an unqualified success. And his son had grown up without him. Nathan thought about Elijah's face, about the calm assessment in those familiar grey-blue eyes. The boy, the man, had studied him the way Nathan studied potential acquisitions. Evaluating worth. Measuring substance. Deciding whether further investment was warranted. He wondered what conclusion Elijah had reached. The memory came unbidden, as memories do when we've spent years trying to suppress them. Chicago in spring, 23 years ago. A different apartment, smaller and shabbier, in a building that had since been demolished to make way for a parking structure. Nathan had been 28 years old and hungrier than he had ever been in his life. He had grown up in Gary, Indiana, the son of a plumber who worked 60-hour weeks and still couldn't afford health insurance. His mother had cleaned houses until her back gave out, then took in sewing until her eyes failed. They had been good people, proud people, people who never complained about what they lacked. Nathan had watched them grow old before their time, worn down by work that never paid enough and bills that never stopped coming. He had sworn he would build a different life, one where money was not a constant crisis, where security was not a distant dream. He had put himself through community college, then transferred to a state university on scholarships and student loans. He had studied finance because finance was where the money lived. He had graduated near the top of his class and clawed his way into an entry-level position at a small investment firm that most of his classmates had never heard of. That was where he was when he met Caroline. She had been a nursing student, volunteering at a hospital fundraiser where Nathan's firm was one of the minor sponsors. He had noticed her across the room, not because she was beautiful, though she was, but because she seemed genuinely interested in the patients the fundraiser was supporting. While everyone else worked the room for connections, she had spent an hour talking to an elderly man in a wheelchair who turned out to be no one important at all. Nathan had introduced himself. She had looked at his cheap suit and his nervous energy and his obvious ambition, and she had seen something worth knowing better. Their courtship had been simple. Walks along the lakefront. Dinners at restaurants where the entries cost under $15. Conversations that lasted until 3 in the morning, covering everything from their families to their fears to their dreams for the future. Caroline had wanted to work with children. She had grown up in a household where medical care was a luxury, and she wanted to ensure that other families didn't face the same choices her parents had faced. She spoke about community health centers and preventive care and making a difference in ways that couldn't be measured by profit margins. Nathan had wanted to be rich. He had wanted to never again worry about rent or groceries or whether he could afford to replace his shoes. He had wanted security and success and the respect that came from having money in a world that respected nothing else. For 2 years, these different ambitions had coexisted. They had lived together in a small apartment in Lincoln Park, pooling their incomes to cover expenses, planning vaguely for a future where their paths would eventually merge into something sustainable. Then Nathan had gotten the opportunity that would change everything. A senior partner at his firm had noticed his work. There was a new fund being launched, focused on distressed assets and turnaround investments. The partner wanted Nathan to lead the Chicago operations, with an equity stake that could be worth millions if the fund succeeded. But the role required total commitment. 80-hour weeks. Constant travel. The sacrifice of everything that didn't serve the fund's success. Nathan had been preparing to say yes when Caroline sat him down in their small kitchen and told him she was pregnant. He could still see her face, 23 years later. The nervousness in her eyes. The hope she couldn't quite suppress. The slight tremor in her hands as she waited for his response. "I know it's not what we planned." She had spoken softly, as if gentleness could cushion the impact. "But I think this could be wonderful, if we let it." Nathan had not let it be wonderful. He had panicked. He had calculated the cost of diapers and daycare and prenatal care, all the expenses that would drain resources from his opportunity. He had imagined himself stuck in Chicago, tied down by responsibility, watching his chance at real success slip away because he had been careless. He had said terrible things. "How do I know it's even mine?" The words had escaped before he could stop them, a desperate attempt to create distance between himself and the life-altering news she had just delivered. "You're gone all the time with your nursing shifts. For all I know, you've been seeing someone else." Caroline's face had crumpled. 23 years later, Nathan could still see the exact moment when the woman who loved him realized that he was not who she had believed him to be. "How can you say that to me?" Her voice had been small, wounded in a way that made him feel powerful and ashamed at the same time. "How can you even think it?" He had doubled down because retreat felt like weakness. "This isn't the right time. We're not ready for this. I'm about to get the biggest opportunity of my life, and you want me to throw it away because you weren't careful enough." "Because I wasn't careful." She had repeated his words with growing horror. "This happened to both of us, Nathan. This is our child." "There is no child." He had spoken with cold finality. "There is a problem that you've created, and I won't let it derail everything I've worked for." The argument had escalated from there. Words were spoken that couldn't be taken back. Accusations were made that poisoned everything they had built together. At some point, Nathan had stormed out, spending the night at his office rather than face the consequences of what he had said. When he returned the next day, already preparing for his trip to meet the senior partners about the new fund, Caroline was gone. Her clothes, her books, her nursing textbooks, the small collection of items that had made their apartment feel like a home. All of it had vanished. She had left her key on the kitchen counter, along with a note written on the back of an envelope. "Don't bother with a paternity test. We don't need anything from you." Nathan had read the note 3 times, waiting for relief to arrive. Instead, he had felt only hollowness, a vast empty space where something important had been. He had told himself it was for the best. That Caroline would realize she couldn't raise a child alone and would reach out when she was ready to be reasonable. That once his fund was established and his position was secure, he could revisit the situation with the resources to handle it properly. But she had never reached out. And he had never looked for her. He had taken the position. The fund had exceeded all expectations. Nathan had earned his equity stake, then used the profits to launch his own firm. Success had followed success, each deal larger than the last, each year bringing more wealth and more recognition and more of everything he had told himself he wanted. Somewhere along the way, he had stopped thinking about Caroline and the child he had refused to acknowledge. He had convinced himself that the pregnancy might not have continued, that even if it had, the child was better off without a father who hadn't wanted him. He had buried the memory so deep that it became almost possible to forget it had ever happened. Almost. Now, standing at his penthouse window at nearly midnight, Nathan finally let himself feel what he had spent 2 decades avoiding. He had a son. A 22-year-old son who was about to become a doctor, who had grown up without a father, who had come to find him not for money or revenge but simply to see the person who had abandoned him. And Caroline had raised that son alone, keeping the same phone number for 23 years in case Nathan ever tried to call. He never had. The morning brought no clarity, only obligations. Nathan's assistant had rescheduled his first 2 meetings, But the board presentation at 11 could not be moved. He showered, dressed in his usual armor of custom suits and confidence, and made his way to the office as if nothing had changed. Everything had changed. Victoria's text arrived at 9:15. "We need to talk. My place. Tonight." Nathan knew what that conversation would contain. He typed back a simple acknowledgement and tried to focus on the day ahead. The board presentation went smoothly. Nathan had given similar presentations hundreds of times, and his body knew the rhythms even when his mind was elsewhere. He discussed acquisition targets and market positions and projected returns, all the vocabulary of wealth that had defined his existence for over 2 decades. Afterward, one of the younger board members approached him. Richard Keller's son had mentioned seeing Nathan at the Aurelia last night. Said there was some kind of scene. Nathan kept his expression neutral. "A personal matter. Nothing that affects the firm." The board member nodded, satisfied, and moved on to other conversations. A personal matter. Nathan almost laughed at the understatement. He had just discovered that his entire adult life had been built on the foundation of an abandonment he had successfully refused to think about. Personal didn't begin to cover it. He left the office at 6, earlier than usual, and drove to Victoria's penthouse on the Gold Coast. She answered the door still dressed for work, her makeup perfect, her posture rigid with a kind of control that suggested significant effort. "Thank you for coming." She stepped aside to let him enter. "I've been thinking all day about what to say." Her apartment was decorated in the same expensive minimalism as Nathan's, all clean lines and neutral colors and art selected by consultants. They had discussed combining households after the wedding, though neither had seemed eager to abandon their own carefully curated spaces. "Who is she?" Victoria's question was direct. "Who is Caroline Prescott?" Nathan sat on her leather sofa, feeling suddenly exhausted. "Someone I knew a long time ago. Before any of this." "You knew her. But you didn't know about the son." "I suspected." Nathan forced himself to be honest. "She told me she was pregnant. I didn't handle it well. I accused her of lying. I walked away. I never confirmed whether the child was actually born." Victoria absorbed this information, her expression unreadable. She had built a career on negotiating complicated situations, and Nathan could see her applying those skills now, analyzing the implications, calculating the costs. "So you abandoned your pregnant girlfriend." Her voice was flat. 23 years ago. "And you never once tried to find out what happened." "I convinced myself it wasn't my responsibility." The words sounded hollow even to Nathan. That she had made her choice and I had made mine. "And now." Victoria crossed her arms. "Now this son appears out of nowhere. Is he going to make a claim against you? Against the firm? He says he doesn't want money." Victoria's laugh was brittle. "Everyone says that at first. Then the lawyers get involved." Nathan shook his head. "He's graduating from medical school. His mother is a clinic director. They built lives without me. Good lives. They're not coming for my money, Victoria. They're not coming for anything. Then why are they here?" "Because he wanted to meet me." Nathan heard the wonder in his own voice. "My son wanted to know who his father was." Victoria was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her tone had shifted from analytical to something colder. "I've been going over this in my head all day. Trying to figure out how I feel about it. About you. About us." Nathan waited. "I can adapt to many things." Victoria moved to the window, her back to him. "Unexpected business complications. Past relationships. Even past indiscretions, if they're handled discreetly. But this is different. This is a secret you kept for 20 years. This is a child you denied. I didn't think about it that way. That's exactly the problem." She turned to face him. "You didn't think about it. You had a son growing up somewhere in this city, and you managed to completely forget about him because it was convenient. The accusation landed because it was true. I'm not proud of who I was back then." Nathan offered the only defense he had. "I was young. I was scared. I was focused on building something and I couldn't see past my own ambition." "And who are you now?" Victoria's eyes met his. "Because the man I agreed to marry was supposed to be someone I could build a future with. Someone who shared my values. I'm not sure that man is the same person who walked away from his pregnant girlfriend. I'm trying to figure that out myself. Victoria nodded slowly, as if she had expected this answer. She crossed to the small table near the entrance and picked up a velvet box Nathan recognized. I think we both need time. She opened the box and looked at the engagement ring inside. This announcement was supposed to run tomorrow. I've already called the Tribune to delay it. Nathan stood. Victoria, I'm sorry. I should have told you. Yes. She closed the box and set it on the table between them. You should have. But more than that, you should have been someone who didn't have this to tell. She walked to the door and opened it, making clear that the conversation was over. I don't know what happens next, Nathan. For you, for us, for any of this. But I know I need space to think. I hope you can respect that. He left without argument. There was nothing else to say. The following days passed in a fog. Nathan went through the motions of his professional life, attending meetings and reviewing reports and making decisions that would affect thousands of employees and billions of dollars. None of it seemed to matter the way it once had. On Thursday, unable to concentrate on a quarterly review, he made a decision that surprised even himself. He left the office at 2 in the afternoon, got in his car, and drove north toward Evanston. He didn't have an address. He only knew that Caroline had mentioned her clinic, that Elijah was training at Northwestern. He drove through neighborhoods he had never visited despite living in Chicago for over 2 decades, past coffee shops and bookstores and schools where ordinary people lived ordinary lives. Eventually he found the clinic. The Evanston Community Health Center occupied a converted warehouse on a tree-lined street, its sign modest but well-maintained. Through the windows, Nathan could see a waiting room filled with patients, some elderly, some young mothers with children, all of them clearly not wealthy. He parked across the street and watched. After 20 minutes, Caroline emerged from the building. She was dressed in professional but practical clothes, carrying a leather bag that looked well worn. A young woman in scrubs followed her, asking questions that Caroline answered with the patience of a teacher. This was her world. A world of service, of community, of purpose that had nothing to do with profit margins or market positions. Nathan watched her chat with a neighbor, help an elderly man navigate the steps, pause to examine a flower blooming in a sidewalk planter. She looked happy. Not the performed happiness of social events and professional networking, but the genuine contentment of someone living in alignment with their values. Nathan thought about his own life. The penthouse with its designer furniture that no one ever sat in. The offices with their glass walls and spectacular views. The restaurants where every meal cost more than some families spent on groceries in a week. He had all of it, and sitting here watching Caroline Prescott walk down a street in Evanston, he realized that none of it had ever made him feel the way she looked right now. She spotted him. He saw the moment of recognition, the slight tension in her shoulders as she processed his presence. For a few seconds, he thought she might turn and walk away. Instead, she said something to her colleague, crossed the street, and approached his car. Nathan rolled down the window, feeling absurdly like a teenager caught somewhere he shouldn't be. You drove all the way up here to sit in your car. Caroline's tone was curious rather than hostile. I wasn't sure you'd want to see me. She considered this, then gestured toward a coffee shop down the block. There's a place with decent coffee. If you want to talk. They walked together in silence, Nathan acutely aware of how out of place his $800 shoes looked on these ordinary sidewalks. The coffee shop was small and crowded, filled with students and remote workers and retired people who clearly came here regularly. Caroline was greeted by name at the counter. They took a table by the window, and Nathan wrapped his hands around a cup of black coffee that cost $3, compared to the $12 lattes his usual places charged. I don't know why I came. Nathan admitted the truth because pretense felt impossible. I just needed to see. To understand. Understand what? How you did it. He looked around the coffee shop, at the community that clearly knew and valued her. How you built all of this without me. Caroline's smile was tinged with something Nathan couldn't quite identify. Sadness, perhaps. Or the patience that came from having asked herself the same question many times. I didn't build it without you, Nathan. I built it because of what you did. Because I had to. She sipped her coffee, giving him time to absorb the distinction. When you left, I was devastated. I won't pretend otherwise. I had planned a whole life around us, And suddenly I was alone and pregnant and completely terrified. I moved back to my aunt's house. I finished nursing school while she helped take care of Elijah. I took every shift I could get. I worked my way up from staff nurse to charge nurse to supervisor to clinic director. And every step of the way, I did it because I had a son who was counting on me. Nathan listened, unable to look away from her face. There were hard years. Caroline continued. Years when I didn't know how I would pay rent and buy groceries in the same month. Years when Elijah was sick and I couldn't afford to take time off. Years when I was so exhausted I would cry in the shower because I didn't want him to see me breaking down. I'm sorry. The words were inadequate, but they were all Nathan had. I know you are. Caroline's voice was gentle, which somehow made it worse. I've known for a long time that you would be sorry, if you ever let yourself think about it. That's not the same thing as changing what happened. She was right. Sorry changed nothing. It was just a word people said when the damage was already done. Tell me about him. Nathan heard himself asking. Tell me about Elijah. What he was like growing up. What I missed. Caroline studied him for a long moment, as if assessing whether he was asking out of genuine interest or just guilt. Whatever she saw must have satisfied her, because she set down her coffee and began to speak. He was a good baby. Slept through the night by 3 months. Smiled at everything. My mother said he was the happiest infant she'd ever seen. Nathan thought about his own infancy, about the photographs his mother had saved in albums that were now boxed up in a storage unit somewhere. He didn't know if he had been a happy baby. His parents had never mentioned it. His first word was light. Caroline smiled at the memory. Not mama, not ball, not anything normal. Light. He was obsessed with the way sunlight came through the windows in the morning. He would point at it and laugh. Nathan tried to picture it. A baby with his eyes, reaching for something beautiful and intangible. He learned to walk early. 10 months. My mother said it was because he was always trying to follow me around. He couldn't stand being left behind. The irony of that statement hung between them, unspoken. Caroline told him about Elijah's childhood. The way he had been fascinated by how things worked, taking apart toys to examine their mechanisms before reassembling them. His passion for reading, devouring books far above his grade level. His quiet compassion for smaller children and hurt animals and anyone who seemed to be struggling. He asked about you when he was 4. Caroline's voice softened. Wanted to know where his daddy was. I told him his daddy lived far away. He accepted it for a while. Then he got older and the questions got harder. What did you tell him? The truth, mostly. Caroline met Nathan's eyes. That you and I had loved each other when we were young. That when I told you about him, you weren't ready. That you helped with money sometimes, which was a lie, but I didn't want him to think you had completely abandoned us. Why? Nathan struggled to understand. Why would you protect me like that? I didn't deserve protection. I wasn't protecting you. I was protecting him. A child shouldn't grow up hating his father. It's too heavy a burden to carry. I wanted Elijah to be free to form his own opinions when he was old enough to handle complexity. So I gave him the simplest version of the story that wasn't completely damning. Nathan absorbed this. For 23 years, Caroline had shielded him from his own son's potential hatred. She had rewritten history to give Elijah room to see his father as something other than a villain. He had done nothing to deserve such grace. What changed? Nathan asked. Why did he decide to find me now? Caroline was quiet for a moment, organizing her thoughts. He's been asking more questions the last few years. Wondering about his medical history, his genetics. Practical things at first. Then more personal things. Last year, when he matched with Northwestern for his residency, he told me he wanted to meet you. Not for a relationship, necessarily. Just to see you once. To know who you were instead of imagining. And you brought him to the restaurant. Caroline shook her head. That was his idea. He looked you up online. Saw the engagement announcement preview. Figured the restaurant would be a place where you couldn't easily escape or brush him off. She allowed herself a slight smile. He has your strategic mind, whether you know it or not. Nathan didn't know whether to be proud or disturbed that his son had essentially ambushed him using business tactics. "He wants to see you again," Caroline continued. "But he's also scared. He's spent his whole life not needing you. Now he's trying to figure out if there's space for you in a life that was complete without you." "What do you want?" Nathan asked. "For yourself, I mean. Not just for Elijah." Caroline considered the question carefully. "I want my son to have whatever he needs to be whole. If that includes knowing you, I'll support it. If he decides you're not worth the emotional investment, I'll support that too. What I want for myself stopped mattering a long time ago, Nathan. I made my peace with you being gone years ago." The finality of her statement was somehow more painful than anger would have been. She had moved on completely. He was not a wound that still hurt, just a scar that had long since healed. "I want to see him again." Nathan heard the desperation in his own voice. "Elijah. I want the chance to know him. That's not my decision to make." Caroline stood, preparing to leave. "He's an adult. You can contact him directly." She paused. "But Nathan, if you're going to do this, do it properly. Don't show up offering money or connections or any of the things you think define your worth. He doesn't need those. He needs to know whether you can actually be present, consistently, without conditions. Whether you can show up for the boring parts and the hard parts, not just the impressive ones." She left him with her empty coffee cup and a number written on a napkin. Elijah's number. Nathan sat in that coffee shop for an hour after she left, holding the napkin like it might disappear if he set it down. Around him, ordinary people went about their ordinary lives, ordering drinks, meeting friends, working on laptops. None of them knew that the man in the expensive suit was trying to work up the courage to call his own son. Finally, his hands trembling slightly, he typed the number into his phone. The response came 2 hours later, while Nathan was stuck in traffic on the drive back to the city. "Mom said you came to Evanston. I have tomorrow off. There's a diner near the hospital where I usually study. We could talk if you want." Nathan read the message 4 times before responding. "I want." The diner was called Maria's, and it had clearly been serving the same menu since the 1970s. Vinyl booths, laminated menus, coffee that cost $1.50 with unlimited refills. Nathan felt conspicuously out of place in his cashmere coat and Italian leather shoes. Elijah was already there, sitting in a corner booth with a medical textbook open in front of him. He looked tired, the fatigue of a medical student in his final months of training, but he closed the book when Nathan approached. "Thank you for meeting me." Nathan slid into the booth across from his son. "I know you don't owe me anything." Elijah studied him with those familiar grey-blue eyes. "I've been thinking about that. About what we owe each other. And you owe me 22 years of being a father." Elijah's voice was matter-of-fact rather than accusatory. "Birthday presents. School events. Life advice. All the things fathers are supposed to provide. I don't owe you anything at all." Nathan accepted this. "You're right. But..." Elijah leaned back in the booth. "I've also been thinking about what I want. For myself. And spending my life being angry at a stranger doesn't seem like a good use of energy." A stranger. The word stung, even though it was accurate. "That's what you are to me." Elijah continued. "I know your face because I've seen pictures. I know your name because it's in magazines. But I don't know what you're afraid of. I don't know what makes you laugh. I don't know if you prefer sunrise or sunset, or what you order at restaurants, or any of the 1,000 small things that make a person real instead of an idea. I order the sea base," Nathan offered, "when I'm at business dinners. Though I don't actually like it that much. It just seems like the appropriate choice." Elijah's mouth quirked slightly. "That's the most honest thing you've said so far." They talked for 2 hours. Nathan learned that his son preferred coffee to tea, that he studied better with background noise than in silence, that he had considered becoming an engineer before deciding that medicine would let him help people more directly. He learned that Elijah had his mother's compassion but his father's analytical mind, an unsettling combination that made Nathan feel like he was being evaluated even during casual conversation. "What do you want from this?" Elijah eventually asked. "From me. From any of this." Nathan considered the question carefully, knowing that his answer mattered. I want the chance to know you. He spoke slowly, trying to find words that were true rather than impressive. Not as the son I abandoned, but as the person you've become. I want to understand who you are, even if I had nothing to do with making you that person. And what are you willing to do for that chance? I don't know. Nathan admitted. I've never done this before. Relationships where I couldn't just buy my way through problems. I'm going to make mistakes. Probably a lot of them. Elijah nodded, as if this was the answer he had expected. At least you're not pretending to have it all figured out. Mom said you were arrogant when you were young. Said you thought you could control everything. I was. Nathan agreed. I thought success was something you achieved through force of will. That any problem could be solved if you were smart enough and worked hard enough. I didn't understand that some things can't be forced. Some things can only be grown, slowly, over time. Like relationships. Like relationships. Nathan looked at his son, seeing traces of himself and traces of Caroline and traces of something entirely new, someone shaped by experiences he could never fully understand. I missed the chance to grow a relationship with you when you were young. I'm hoping you'll give me the chance to try now. Elijah was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was softer than it had been. My mom never talked badly about you. Even when I was angry and wanted her to validate my anger, she wouldn't. She always said that people are more complicated than their worst moments. That you probably had reasons for what you did, even if those reasons weren't good enough. Your mother is a remarkable person. She is. Elijah agreed. She raised me to believe that everyone deserves a chance to prove who they really are. That the story isn't over until it's over. He looked at Nathan directly, and for the first time, there was something other than assessment in his eyes. Something like cautious hope. So I'm going to give you a chance. Not because you deserve it, but because I want to see if the person you are now is different from the person who left. I have a graduation ceremony in 3 weeks. Mom will be there. Her friends from the clinic will be there. People who became family when we didn't have any. Nathan waited, sensing that the invitation was coming but not wanting to presume. I'd like you to be there too. Elijah continued. Not to prove anything to anyone else. Just to be present. To see what you missed. To understand what my mother built while you were busy building your empire. I'll be there. Elijah nodded, then gathered his textbook and prepared to leave. But Nathan, if you're going to do this, don't flake. Don't get distracted by some business emergency that seems more important. I've spent my whole life being the thing you considered less important than your career. If you show up for real. He left Nathan alone in the booth, surrounded by the smell of coffee and the chatter of ordinary people living ordinary lives. Nathan sat there for another hour, thinking about everything he had heard and everything he had yet to understand. His phone buzzed with work messages. Board updates, acquisition proposals, earnings reports. All the machinery of his empire, grinding along as it always had. For 20 years, those messages had been the most important things in his life, the pulse that told him he was successful, that he mattered, that his sacrifices had been worthwhile. Now they just seemed like noise. He thought about Caroline, building a life from nothing while he built a fortune. He thought about Elijah, becoming a doctor who would heal children while his father traded corporations like playing cards. He thought about Victoria, probably already redecorating her penthouse to remove any trace of their relationship. He thought about the man he had been at 28, so certain that success meant money and fear meant weakness. That man had made a choice that he'd spent 2 decades refusing to examine. Now, finally, he was beginning to understand what that choice had cost. 3 weeks. That was how long he had to prepare for his son's graduation. 3 weeks to begin demonstrating that he could be present, could be consistent, could show up for something that couldn't be measured in dollars or percentage points. 3 weeks to start proving that the father Elijah had never known was worth knowing after all. Nathan looked down at his phone, at the endless stream of messages demanding his attention, and for the first time in his adult life, he put it away without responding. There would be time for business later. Right now, he needed to figure out how to be human. The days that followed were unlike anything in Nathan's experience. He went through the motions of his professional life, but his mind was elsewhere, replaying conversations, examining memories, trying to understand how he had become someone capable of abandoning his own child. He started seeing things differently. At a board meeting, discussing the acquisition of a company that would require layoffs, he found himself thinking about the families that would be affected. At a charity gala, surrounded by people competing to display their generosity, he noticed how performative it all was, how divorced from actual service. He drove to Evanston twice more, parking near the clinic just to watch Caroline come and go. He wasn't stalking her, exactly. He was studying her, trying to understand the life she had built in his absence. On the second visit, she spotted him again and approached his car with an expression somewhere between amusement and exasperation. "If you're going to keep showing up, you might as well make yourself useful." "What do you mean?" "The clinic is always short-staffed. We could use volunteers for administrative work. Filing, data entry, answering phones. Nothing glamorous." Nathan looked at her, uncertain whether she was serious. "You want me to volunteer? At your clinic? I want you to understand what actually helping people looks like. Not writing checks and attending galas. Actually showing up, doing work, making a difference you can see." It was a challenge, Nathan realized. She was testing him, seeing whether he was capable of service without recognition, effort without reward. "When should I start?" "Tomorrow." Caroline handed him a card with the clinic's address. 8 in the morning. Wear something you don't mind getting coffee stains on. Nathan arrived at 7:45, dressed in khakis and a polo shirt that had cost him $300 but at least didn't scream corporate executive. The clinic was already busy, patients filling the waiting room, staff moving efficiently through hallways that were clean but clearly underfunded. Caroline assigned him to the front desk, answering phones and helping patients navigate the check-in process. It was simple work, the kind of task Nathan would have delegated without a second thought in his professional life. But there was nothing simple about the people he served. An elderly woman with diabetes who couldn't afford her medication came in hoping the clinic could help her find assistance programs. A young mother with 3 children needed vaccinations but wasn't sure if she qualified for the state program. A middle-aged man who had lost his job and his insurance was experiencing chest pains he had been ignoring because he couldn't afford an emergency room visit. Nathan watched Caroline and her staff navigate these situations with compassion and competence. They knew the systems, the resources, the workarounds that could help people who had been failed by a healthcare system designed for those who could afford it. This was what his son had chosen. Not the wealth and prestige Nathan had pursued, but this. Service to people who had nothing to offer in return except gratitude. By noon, Nathan was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical labor. His feet hurt from standing. His throat was dry from talking. His brain was overwhelmed by the sheer volume of need he had witnessed. Caroline found him in the break room, drinking water and staring at nothing. "Most people don't come back after the first day." Her voice was neutral, not judging either way. "They realize that helping people is harder than writing checks." "I'll be back." Nathan heard the determination in his own voice. "Tomorrow. And the day after." She studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "We'll see." Nathan did come back. Day after day, he arrived at the clinic at 8 in the morning and stayed until the last patient was seen. He learned the intake procedures, the insurance codes, the complex bureaucracy of serving people who had been systematically failed by every institution designed to protect them. He also learned things about his son. Elijah had volunteered at this same clinic since he was 16. The staff remembered him, spoke of him with obvious affection. The young man who would organize supply closets without being asked. Who would sit with anxious children and distract them with stories while they waited. Who had chosen pediatric medicine specifically because he wanted to be the kind of doctor these families deserved. A photograph on the break room wall showed a teenage Elijah with several clinic staff members, all of them beaming at the camera. Nathan studied that photograph every day, trying to memorize the face of the boy he had never known. 2 weeks before the graduation, Victoria called. "I've had time to think." Her voice was measured, controlled. "I've decided that our engagement is over. Permanently." Nathan had expected this. The surprise was how little it affected him. "I understand." "I'm not sure you do." Victoria continued. "When we got together, I thought we were building something. 2 successful people creating a partnership that made sense. I didn't sign up for complicated family situations and emotional reckonings with the past." "I know. What I don't understand is why you're not fighting for this." Victoria's tone shifted, revealing genuine confusion. The Nathan I knew would have negotiated, strategized, found some way to make this work. Instead, you're just accepting it. Like our relationship doesn't matter. Nathan considered his response carefully. Our relationship did matter. It represented the life I thought I wanted. The perfect partnership with the perfect person for the perfect future. But Victoria, that future was built on pretending the past didn't exist. I can't do that anymore. I have a son. I missed 22 years of his life. If I'm going to have any chance of being part of his future, I can't keep living like the man who abandoned him. Victoria was quiet for a moment. Then, I hope you find what you're looking for. I really do. Thank you for understanding. The call ended, and Nathan felt another piece of his old life fall away. The penthouse that no longer felt like home. The fiancée who had never really known him. The empire that seemed increasingly pointless. In their place, slowly, something new was growing. Relationships built on presence rather than performance. Purpose defined by service rather than success. The fragile possibility of connection with the son he had spent 2 decades denying. It wasn't enough. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But it was a beginning. The night before the graduation, Nathan couldn't sleep. He lay in his penthouse, staring at the ceiling, thinking about everything that would happen tomorrow. He would sit in an auditorium full of strangers, watching his son receive a medical degree he had played no part in earning. He would see Caroline surrounded by the community she had built, the family she had created from nothing. He would be an outsider looking in at the life that had flourished in his absence. His phone buzzed. A text from Elijah. Can't sleep either. Weird that tomorrow is finally here. Nathan typed back. Nervous. A little. Mostly just ready. 4 years of medical school, and tomorrow it's finally real. Nathan hesitated, then wrote. I'm proud of you. I know I have no right to say that. But I am. The response took a moment. Mom says pride is something you earn by being present. By showing up. You haven't earned it yet. Nathan absorbed the gentle correction. You're right. I haven't. But she also says that everyone deserves a chance to start earning it. So show up tomorrow. Be present. Don't make this about you or your guilt or your redemption. Just be there, and watch, and understand what you missed. I will. Good. Another pause. Get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to be long. Nathan set down his phone, still unable to sleep but somehow more at peace than he had been in weeks. Tomorrow would be hard. Tomorrow he would confront the full weight of everything he had chosen to miss. But he would be there. Present. Watching. Beginning to understand. It was more than he had given his son in 22 years. It was, perhaps, a start. The morning of the graduation arrived with a kind of perfect spring weather that felt almost theatrical. Blue sky, gentle breeze, sunlight that made everything look hopeful and new. Nathan stood in front of his closet for 20 minutes, paralyzed by a decision that should have been simple. What does a man wear to watch a son he abandoned receive a medical degree? He finally chose a navy suit, conservative but not ostentatious. No cufflinks that cost more than some people's monthly rent. No watch that announced his net worth to anyone paying attention. He wanted to blend in, to be present without being conspicuous. The auditorium was already filling when he arrived. Families clustered in groups, holding flowers and balloons, cameras ready to capture the moment their loved ones crossed the stage. Nathan found a seat near the back, away from the prime viewing areas, and watched the crowd with the analytical attention he usually reserved for business negotiations. He spotted Caroline near the front, surrounded by people who were clearly not family by blood but family by choice. Colleagues from the clinic, neighbors from Evanston, friends accumulated over 2 decades of building a life. They laughed and embraced and saved seats for latecomers, a community so obviously bonded that Nathan felt its warmth even from 30 rows away. He belonged nowhere in that picture. The ceremony began with the usual pomp and circumstance. Speeches about dedication and service and the sacred responsibility of healing. Nathan listened with half his attention, the rest focused on scanning the rows of black-robed graduates for his son's face. When the dean began reading names, Nathan's heart rate increased. He watched graduate after graduate cross the stage, each one representing years of sacrifice and study, each one surrounded by family members who had been present for the journey. Elijah Marcus Prescott. Nathan heard the name and felt something crack open in his chest. Marcus. Caroline's father, dead before Elijah was born. His son carried the name of a man he had never met, a grandfather who existed only in stories and photographs. Not Nathan's father. Not anyone from the Ashford line. Just the legacy of the family that had actually been there. Elijah crossed the stage with quiet confidence, accepting his diploma and hood with a composed dignity that Nathan was beginning to recognize as his son's default state. He didn't search the crowd for validation. He didn't need external approval to know what he had accomplished. Caroline was on her feet, applauding with tears streaming down her face. The people around her embraced and cheered, celebrating the young man they had watched grow from infant to doctor. Nathan remained seated, clapping with hands that felt disconnected from his body, watching a moment he had done nothing to earn. The ceremony continued, but Nathan had stopped processing. His mind kept returning to that middle name, to the legacy it represented. Elijah had been named for someone who mattered, someone who had been present in spirit if not in body. Nathan had not even been present in spirit. He had been actively absent, deliberately ignorant, willfully disconnected from the life growing up without him. When the final graduate had crossed the stage and the recessional began, Nathan stayed in his seat while families flooded toward their new doctors. He watched Caroline reach Elijah first, pulling him into an embrace that contained 22 years of sacrifice and love. He watched the clinic staff surround them, each one adding their congratulations to the chorus. He watched his son be celebrated by everyone except him. Eventually, Elijah's eyes found him across the crowded auditorium. A brief nod of acknowledgement. Nothing more, but nothing less. Nathan rose from his seat and began making his way through the crowd, feeling more out of place with every step. By the time he reached the group, the initial excitement had settled into the comfortable buzz of people who knew each other well. Caroline noticed him first, her expression shifting to something careful and watchful. "Nathan. You came. I said I would." She nodded, then turned to the group. "Everyone, this is Nathan. Elijah's father." The words hung in the air, simple and devastating. Elijah's father. Not the man who raised him, not the person who had been there for scraped knees and school plays and teenage heartbreaks. Just the biological fact of his existence, stated without embellishment or excuse. The reactions were varied but uniformly restrained. A few polite nods. Some curious glances. One older woman, who Nathan would later learn had been Caroline's supervisor during her first years as a nurse, looked at him with an expression that suggested she knew exactly what he had done and had chosen not to forgive him for it. No one was hostile. That would have been easier to handle. Instead, they simply made room for him in the circle, including him without embracing him, present without welcoming. "Congratulations." Nathan addressed Elijah directly, hoping his voice sounded steadier than it felt. "Dr. Prescott." Elijah's mouth quirked in acknowledgement of the title. "Thanks. It doesn't feel real yet." "It will." One of the clinic nurses, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and practical hands, squeezed Elijah's shoulder. "First time someone calls you doctor in the middle of the night when you're exhausted and terrified, it'll feel real." The group laughed at what was obviously an inside joke, and Nathan stood on the outside of it, watching his son be loved by people who had earned the right. Caroline touched his arm briefly. "We're having a reception at my house. You're welcome to come. If you want to." It was an invitation, not an expectation. Nathan could have declined, could have made an excuse about business obligations or prior commitments. 3 months ago, he would have. "I'd like that." He heard himself accept. "If it's not an imposition." Caroline's expression softened slightly, as if his humility surprised her. "It's not an imposition. Just don't expect to be the center of attention. Today is about Elijah." "I understand." The drive to Evanston took 40 minutes in graduation traffic. Nathan followed the caravan of cars, feeling like an outsider trailing a family migration. When he finally pulled up to Caroline's house, the blue craftsman bungalow he had observed from a distance weeks ago, he sat in his car for several minutes, gathering courage. The house was already full when he entered. Music played softly from somewhere. The smell of home-cooked food filled the air. Children ran through the rooms, belonging to neighbors and colleagues, adding chaos and joy to the celebration. Nathan stood in the doorway, trying to orient himself in a space that felt completely foreign despite its obvious warmth. The walls were covered with photographs. Elijah as a baby, held by a younger Caroline who looked exhausted but radiant. Elijah as a toddler, taking tentative steps across this same living room floor. Elijah in elementary school, missing front teeth and grinning at the camera. High school graduation. College acceptance. Every milestone documented and displayed with obvious pride. One wall held growth marks penciled directly onto the doorframe. Nathan approached it slowly, reading the dates and measurements. Elijah at 2, barely reaching Nathan's knee. At 5, at 8, at 12. The mark stopped when Elijah would have been around 15, presumably too old to tolerate the ritual. 22 years of growth, measured and recorded on a wall Nathan had never seen. That was my idea. Caroline's voice came from beside him. My mother used to do it for me when I was growing up. I wanted Elijah to have the same thing. Nathan traced one of the pencil lines with his finger. October 1999. Elijah would have been 3. He was obsessed with dinosaurs that year. Caroline smiled at the memory. Wanted to be a paleontologist. Changed his mind every few months after that. Astronaut, firefighter, baseball player. Doctor didn't show up until high school. What changed? Caroline was quiet for a moment. A girl in his class got leukemia. Sophie Martinez. Elijah used to visit her in the hospital, bring her books, keep her company during treatments. She died the summer before senior year. A week later, Elijah told me he wanted to be a pediatric oncologist. Nathan absorbed this. His son's career path had been shaped by grief and compassion, by watching a friend suffer and deciding to spend his life preventing that suffering for others. It was so far from Nathan's own motivations, his desperate flight from poverty, that it felt like learning about a different species. He chose to serve. Nathan said quietly, not to succeed. He chose to matter. Caroline corrected. In ways that can't be measured by money or status. In ways you never understood. It wasn't an accusation. Just a statement of fact, delivered with the same gentle clarity Caroline had maintained throughout their renewed acquaintance. I'm beginning to. Nathan turned to face her. Slowly. But I'm beginning to. The party continued around them. Nathan found himself drawn into conversations with people who had known his son for years. The Little League coach who had recognized Elijah's leadership abilities at age 9. The chemistry teacher who had written his medical school recommendation. The elderly neighbor who still made Elijah's favorite cookies on his birthday. Each conversation was another window into the life Nathan had missed. Another reminder of the community that had raised his son while Nathan accumulated wealth in his empty penthouse. An older woman approached him near the buffet table. She was perhaps 70, with white hair pulled back in a neat bun and eyes that missed nothing. You're the father. Yes, I'm Ruth. She did not offer her hand. I was Caroline's supervisor when she started at the hospital. I watched her raise that boy on her own, working double shifts, going back to school for her advanced degree, never once complaining about what she didn't have. Nathan waited, sensing there was more. I don't know why you did what you did. Ruth's voice was steady. I don't particularly care to know. What I do know is that you're here now, and that means something. Caroline wouldn't have invited you if she didn't think you were capable of change. I'm trying. Trying isn't enough. Ruth fixed him with a stare that reminded Nathan of his own grandmother, long dead. Results matter. Consistency matters. Being there when it's hard, not just when it's convenient. That's what being a father means. I know. Ruth studied him for a long moment, then nodded once. We'll see if you actually do. She moved away, leaving Nathan alone with his plate of food he hadn't tasted and his thoughts he couldn't escape. The party wound down slowly, guests departing in waves, each one hugging Elijah and Caroline with the familiarity of long relationship. Nathan stayed until nearly everyone had left, helping to collect empty plates and fold chairs, doing whatever small tasks presented themselves. When the last guest had gone, leaving only Nathan, Caroline, and Elijah in the quiet house, the energy shifted. The public celebration was over. What remained was private, uncertain, unscripted. Elijah sat on the couch, still in his dress shirt but with his tie loosened, looking exhausted in the particular way of someone who had just completed a major life milestone. Caroline had kicked off her heels and was moving through the kitchen, putting away leftover food with the efficient motions of someone who had done this 1,000 times. Nathan stood in the living room, unsure what to do with himself. "You can sit down." Elijah's voice carried a hint of amusement. "We don't bite." Nathan sat in an armchair across from his son, the same chair he had noticed in several photographs over the years. Evidence suggested it had been Caroline's mother's favorite spot before she died. "Today was good." Nathan offered the observation carefully. "You should be proud of what you've accomplished." Elijah shrugged. "I'm tired." "Pride will come later, when it sinks in." They sat in silence for a moment. From the kitchen came the sounds of Caroline finishing her cleanup, the domestic rhythm of a household Nathan had never been part of. "I've been thinking." Elijah finally spoke. "About what comes next. For us, I mean." Nathan waited. "When I was a kid, I used to imagine meeting you." Elijah's voice was thoughtful, not accusatory. "I had all these scenarios in my head. Sometimes you were a hero who had been kept away by circumstances beyond your control. Sometimes you were a villain who deserved my hatred. I spent years cycling through these stories, trying to figure out which one was true." "What did you decide?" "That neither was true." Elijah met Nathan's eyes. "You're not a hero or a villain. You're just a person who made a choice. A bad choice. One that hurt my mother and deprived me of a father. But also one that led to the life I actually have, which is pretty good despite missing that piece." Nathan absorbed this. "Your mother raised you to be remarkably forgiving. She raised me to be realistic." Elijah corrected. "Forgiveness isn't forgetting. It's not pretending the hurt didn't happen. It's deciding that the hurt doesn't get to control your future. I spent enough years being angry at a stranger. I don't want to spend the rest of my life that way. So where does that leave us?" Elijah was quiet for a moment. "I don't know. I start my residency in 3 weeks. 80-hour weeks, night shifts, the hardest years of training ahead. I won't have time or energy for some elaborate relationship-building project." "I understand. But..." Elijah leaned forward. "I also don't want to close the door completely. You've been showing up at the clinic. Mom says you're actually useful, which is high praise from her. That suggests you might be capable of consistency. I'm trying to be. So here's what I'm thinking." Elijah's tone became practical, almost businesslike. "We start small. A phone call once a week. Maybe dinner once a month. No pressure, no expectations, no dramatic father-son moments. Just getting to know each other like two adults who are deciding whether they want to be in each other's lives." Nathan felt something loosen in his chest. "That sounds reasonable. And if it doesn't work, we can stop. No guilt, no obligation. Just an honest acknowledgement that some things can't be fixed." "Agreed." Elijah nodded, then stood. "I should get some sleep. Early morning tomorrow, cleaning out my apartment before the move." Nathan rose as well. "Where are you moving?" "I found a place near the hospital. Closer to the commute, which I'll need during residency. If you need help with the move," Nathan offered tentatively. "I'm available." Elijah studied him for a moment, as if assessing whether the offer was genuine. "Saturday, 9 in the morning. Don't be late." "I won't." Caroline appeared in the doorway, watching the exchange with an expression Nathan couldn't quite read. "I'll walk you out," she said to Nathan. The night air was cool and quiet, the neighborhood settling into sleep. Nathan and Caroline stood on her front porch, the same porch where they had talked weeks ago, when all of this was just beginning. "Thank you," Nathan said. "For today. For inviting me. I did it for Elijah." Caroline's voice was gentle but clear. "He wanted you here. I support what he wants, even when I'm not sure it's wise." "You think this is unwise?" "I think you're capable of hurting him in ways I can't protect against anymore." She met his eyes. "He's an adult. He gets to make his own choices, including the choice to let you into his life. But if you hurt him, Nathan, if you disappear again or prioritize your business or treat him like an obligation instead of a person, I will never forgive you." The warning was delivered without heat, which made it more powerful. "I understand." "I'm not sure you do." Caroline crossed her arms. You've spent 30 years thinking about yourself. Your career, your success, your comfort. Learning to think about someone else, consistently, is harder than you realize. Nathan considered this. You're right. I don't know if I'm capable of it yet. But I want to try. Caroline studied him for a long moment, then nodded. Ruth told me what she said to you. About results mattering more than intentions. She's direct. She's also right. Caroline moved toward the door. Actions matter, Nathan. Not promises, not plans, not good intentions. What you actually do, day after day, when no one's watching, when it's inconvenient. That's what will determine whether any of this works. I know. Caroline paused at the door. One more thing. I've already forgiven you. Years ago. Not for you, for me. Carrying anger is exhausting, and I needed that energy for raising our son. But forgiveness doesn't mean trust. Trust is something you earn. And you haven't earned it yet. She went inside, closing the door softly behind her. Nathan stood on the porch for several minutes, looking up at the stars visible through the suburban light pollution, thinking about everything he had learned and everything he still needed to prove. The weeks that followed established a new pattern in Nathan's life. He showed up at Elijah's apartment on Saturday morning with coffee and moving boxes, wearing old clothes he had purchased specifically for the occasion. The move took most of the day, hauling furniture up 3 flights of stairs, arranging books and medical equipment, assembling the IKEA bookshelf that came with missing screws and incomprehensible instructions. By evening, Nathan was more physically exhausted than he had been in decades. His back ached. His hands were blistered. His designer shirt, worn ironically, was ruined beyond salvage. He couldn't remember the last time he had felt so useful. The weekly phone calls began the following Tuesday. Nathan called at 7 in the evening, the time Elijah had specified as least likely to conflict with his schedule. Their first conversation lasted 11 minutes and covered safe topics: weather, sports, the logistics of residency orientation. But each subsequent call went a little longer, ventured a little deeper. Nathan learned about the patients Elijah was seeing, the challenges of navigating hospital hierarchy, the exhaustion that came from 36-hour shifts. He learned to listen more than he spoke, to ask questions rather than offer solutions. He learned, slowly, how to be interested in someone else's life. The monthly dinners began in July, once Elijah's residency schedule had stabilized enough to predict his rare evenings off. Nathan let Elijah choose the restaurants, ordinary places with reasonable prices and unpretentious menus. They talked about medicine and business, about Caroline's clinic and Nathan's foundation, about everything except the 22 years that had separated them. Some conversations were awkward. Some ended with long silences that neither knew how to fill. But neither stopped showing up, and over time, the awkwardness began to fade into something resembling comfort. Nathan also continued volunteering at the clinic, reducing his schedule at Ashford Capital Partners to accommodate the commitment. His board was confused by the shift. His colleagues were concerned. But Nathan found that he cared less about their opinions than he once would have. 6 months into the new arrangement, he made a decision that surprised even himself. He called a board meeting and announced his intention to restructure the company. Janet Morrison, his COO for 15 years, would become CEO. Nathan would step back to chairman, maintaining strategic oversight but relinquishing daily operations. The board members exchanged glances. Richard Keller, the longest-serving member, finally spoke. "This is unexpected, Nathan. May we ask what's prompting this change? I've recently discovered that I have a son." Nathan spoke simply, without drama. He's 23 years old. I missed his entire childhood. I'm trying not to miss the rest of his life. The room fell silent. Nathan could see the calculations happening behind their eyes, the concern about leadership transitions and stock prices and the 100 practical implications of his announcement. Janet is more than capable of running this company. Nathan continued. She's been doing most of the operational work for years. This transition formalizes what's already true and frees me to focus on things that matter more than quarterly earnings. Richard studied him. You've built this company from nothing. You've spent 30 years making it what it is. And you're willing to step back for a relationship with a son you just met. I'm willing to try. Nathan met his gaze. I'm not sure I know how to be a father. But I know I can't learn while spending 80 hours a week in boardrooms and strategy sessions. The vote was contentious, but ultimately the board approved the restructuring. Nathan walked out of that meeting feeling lighter than he had in years, as if some invisible weight had finally been lifted from his shoulders. That evening, he called Elijah to share the news. "You gave up your company." Elijah's voice was incredulous. "For me. I didn't give it up. I stepped back. There's a difference. The company will be fine. Janet is excellent. But still." Elijah paused. "That's a big change." It was time. Nathan looked out his penthouse window at the city he had spent decades conquering. "I spent my whole life building something that will outlast me but doesn't need me. Now I need to build something that does." The line was quiet for a moment. Then Elijah spoke, his voice softer than Nathan had ever heard it. "Mom's going to be insufferable about this. She's been saying for years that you would eventually figure out what actually matters. Your mother is usually right about most things." "Yeah." Elijah agreed. "She is." The first Christmas approached with a weight of symbolic significance. Nathan had spent countless holidays alone in his penthouse, attending charity galas and client dinners, but never anything that resembled family celebration. This year would be different. The invitation came from Elijah, delivered casually during their weekly phone call. "Mom's having people over for Christmas. Clinic staff, neighbors, the usual crowd. She said you could come if you want." Nathan's heart rate increased. "Do you want me there?" "I wouldn't have mentioned it if I didn't." "Then I'll be there." Christmas morning at Caroline's house was chaos in the best possible sense. Children belonging to various guests raced through the rooms, showing off new toys and creating cheerful noise. Adults gathered in the kitchen and living room, drinking coffee and champagne and swapping stories about holidays past. Nathan arrived with gifts, carefully chosen with more thought than he had ever applied to presents before. For Caroline, a first edition of a novel she had mentioned loving during their nursing school days, obtained through a rare book dealer at considerable expense. For Elijah, a vintage stethoscope that had belonged to a pioneering pediatrician, sourced from a medical history museum. Both gifts were received with surprise and genuine pleasure. "You remembered." Caroline held the book with something approaching wonder. "I mentioned this once, 25 years ago." "I remembered," Nathan admitted. "I didn't know I remembered until I started looking for something meaningful to give you." The day passed in a blur of food and conversation and the warm chaos of community. Nathan found himself drafted into various tasks, helping an elderly neighbor navigate the buffet table, listening to a clinic nurse's lengthy story about her grandchildren, supervising a group of children in what was apparently an annual Christmas puzzle competition. None of it resembled the calculated networking of charity galas or the strategic relationship building of business events. These people weren't useful to him. They couldn't advance his career or enhance his portfolio. They were simply people, living their lives, and somehow Nathan had been allowed to be part of it. At dinner, Elijah offered a toast that made Nathan's throat tighten. "To family." He raised his glass. "The one we're born into, the one we choose, and the one we're still figuring out." His eyes met Nathan's across the table. The message was clear. "You're on probation, but you're here. That's something." Nathan raised his glass in silent acknowledgement. After the meal, as guests settled into post-feast lethargy, Nathan found himself alone on the back porch with Caroline. The night was cold, their breath-forming clouds in the winter air, but neither moved to go inside. "Thank you," Caroline spoke first. "For the book. For being here today. Thank you for letting me come." She was quiet for a moment, watching the stars. "I've been thinking a lot lately. About the past. About what happened between us." Nathan waited, sensing this was something she needed to say. "When you left, I thought my life was over." She spoke slowly, choosing her words with care. "I was pregnant and alone and completely terrified. I had no money, no support system, no plan. I cried every night for months. I'm sorry." Nathan felt the inadequacy of the words even as he spoke them. "I know you are," Caroline continued. "But here's what I've realized, after all these years. Your leaving was the worst thing that ever happened to me. And it was also the best thing." Nathan turned to look at her. "If you had stayed," she said, "you would have resented me." Resented Elijah. You would have been physically present but emotionally absent, and eventually, you would have left anyway, but not before poisoning everything with your unhappiness. I would have spent years trying to make you love a life you didn't want, and I would have failed, and our son would have grown up with a father who wished he didn't exist. I don't know if that's true. I do. Caroline met his eyes. I knew who you were, Nathan. Even then. I knew your ambition would always come first. I just hoped I was wrong. When I realized I wasn't, I had two choices: fall apart, or build something better. You built something extraordinary. I built a life. She shrugged. It wasn't extraordinary to me. It was just what I had to do. Get up every day, take care of my son, work hard, love the people around me. That's not extraordinary. That's just showing up. It's extraordinary to me. Nathan felt tears threatening, which hadn't happened in longer than he could remember. I spent my whole life building something the world calls impressive. Compared to what you built, it's nothing. Caroline studied him for a long moment. Then she reached out and touched his arm, the first voluntary physical contact between them since their reunion began. The man who left me 25 years ago wouldn't have understood that. He would have argued about metrics and market valuations and all the ways his success was more real than mine. I was a fool. Yes. She agreed. But you're here now. Learning. Trying. That's not nothing. They stood in silence for a while, watching the winter sky. I don't think we can be what we were, Caroline finally said. Too much time has passed. Too much has happened. We're different people now. I know. But I think we could be something else. She turned to face him. Co-parents to an adult child. Allies. Maybe even friends. Eventually. If you keep showing up. I intend to. We'll see. Caroline smiled slightly. Words are easy. Time will tell. She went back inside, leaving Nathan alone with the cold and the stars and the fragile possibility of redemption. The years that followed were a gradual accumulation of small moments. Nathan learned to be present without being intrusive. He attended Elijah's white coat ceremony when his son officially became a resident. He showed up at the clinic every week, eventually becoming skilled enough at intake procedures that Caroline started trusting him with more complex administrative tasks. He spent holidays in Evanston, becoming a familiar face to the community that had raised his son. There were setbacks. A month when work pressures pulled Nathan back into old patterns, causing him to miss 2 weekly calls in a row. A tense conversation where Elijah called him out on reverting to check writing instead of showing up. A period when Caroline grew distant after Nathan said something thoughtless about her clinic's funding challenges. But each setback became an opportunity to demonstrate change. Nathan apologized when he was wrong. He adjusted his behavior based on feedback. He learned, slowly and imperfectly, how to prioritize relationships over accomplishments. 3 years after the restaurant confrontation, Elijah called with news that made Nathan's heart stop. I'm getting married. The words took a moment to process. Nathan had met Grace several times, a fellow pediatric resident with kind eyes and a laugh that could fill a room. He had suspected their relationship was serious, but marriage still felt sudden. Congratulations. Nathan managed. Grace is wonderful. She is. Elijah paused. We're keeping it small. Just family and close friends. I wanted to ask you something. Nathan waited, afraid to hope. I'm not asking you to walk me down the aisle. Elijah spoke carefully. That role belongs to no one, really. Mom raised me. She's the one who gets any ceremonial position. I understand. But I was wondering if you would give a toast. At the reception. Just a few words. Nathan felt tears threatening again. You want me to speak? At your wedding. I want the people I care about to be there. And over the past 3 years, you've become one of those people. Not because of biology. Because you showed up. I would be honored. The wedding was held in Caroline's backyard, transformed for the occasion into a garden of white flowers and soft lights. Nathan sat among the guests, watching his son marry a woman who loved him, surrounded by the community that had raised him, and felt gratitude so overwhelming it was almost painful. When the time came for his toast, Nathan stood on shaky legs and looked out at the assembled guests. Many of them he now knew by name. Ruth, who had challenged him that first Christmas. The clinic staff who had watched him transform from awkward volunteer to reliable fixture. The neighbors who had stopped treating him like an outsider and started greeting him by name. And at the center of it all, Caroline and Elijah, the family he had abandoned and somehow been allowed to rejoin. "I'm not good at speeches," Nathan began. "In business, I always knew exactly what to say. In matters of the heart, I'm still learning." Soft laughter from the guests who knew his story. 25 years ago, I made a choice I will regret for the rest of my life. I walked away from a woman I loved and a child I was too afraid to face. I told myself I was building something important. I was wrong. He looked at Caroline, who met his gaze with an expression of quiet acceptance. The important things were being built here. In this house. In this community. By a woman who chose love over bitterness, who raised a son to be compassionate and strong, who created a family out of friends and neighbors and sheer determination. He turned to Elijah and Grace. "Elijah, I have no right to be proud of you. I contributed nothing to the man you became. But I am proud. Proud of your dedication to healing others. Proud of your capacity for forgiveness. Proud that you gave me a chance I didn't deserve." His voice cracked slightly. "Grace, you're joining a remarkable family. Not just Elijah and Caroline, but all of these people who loved him into being the man you're marrying. Take care of each other. Be present for each other. Don't make my mistakes." He raised his glass. "To Elijah and Grace. May you build a life even half as beautiful as the one your mother built. That would be more than enough." The toast was received with applause and tears. Elijah crossed the room and embraced Nathan, a real embrace, not the awkward half-hugs of their early relationship. Caroline raised her glass from across the room, a small nod of acknowledgement. Later, as the reception wound down and guests drifted into the evening, Nathan found himself standing by the garden's edge with Ruth, the elderly woman who had challenged him so directly at that first Christmas. "You've changed," she observed. "I've tried." "It's not trying anymore." Ruth shook her head. "Trying implies effort. What I see now is just who you are." Nathan considered this. "I'm not sure that's true. It still feels like work sometimes." "Of course it does." Ruth laughed. "Love is work. Family is work. Anything worth having requires effort. The difference is whether the effort feels like obligation or investment. You used to show up like you were checking boxes. Now you show up like you belong here." "Do I?" Nathan asked. "Belong here." Ruth studied him with the same sharp assessment she had applied years ago. "You're getting there." 5 years after the restaurant confrontation, Nathan's life looked nothing like it once had. He had sold the Chicago penthouse, purchasing instead a modest home in Evanston, 3 blocks from Caroline's house. His involvement with Ashford Capital Partners had dwindled to quarterly board meetings and occasional strategic consultations. His days were filled with clinic work, community involvement, and the slow accumulation of relationships that had nothing to do with wealth or power. Elijah's first child was born on a Tuesday in September. Nathan was at the hospital within an hour, not because anyone called him, but because he had been tracking the pregnancy milestones for months and knew the due date was approaching. He found Caroline already there, holding her granddaughter with the practiced ease of someone who had been waiting for this moment. "She looks like Elijah did," Caroline said softly. "The same expression. Curious about everything." Nathan looked at the tiny face, at the next generation of a family he had almost abandoned entirely. "What's her name?" Elijah appeared in the doorway, exhausted but radiant. "We're calling her Rose. After Grace's grandmother." "Rose," Nathan repeated. "It's perfect." They stood together, 3 generations present and 1 arriving, in a hospital room that smelled of flowers and possibility. Nathan thought about all the hospital rooms he had never been in. The one where Elijah was born. The countless emergency visits and sick days and minor injuries that Caroline had navigated alone. He couldn't fix the past. But he could be here now. He could hold his granddaughter and feel her tiny fingers wrap around his thumb. He could watch his son become a father and remember everything he had missed and be grateful for everything he hadn't. 2 weeks later, sitting on Caroline's porch while the sunset painted the sky orange and pink, Nathan finally asked the question that had been haunting him. "If I hadn't shown up at that restaurant, if I had never known about Elijah, Do you think he would have been better off? Caroline considered this carefully. That's not really a fair question. I know. But I need to ask it. She was quiet for a long moment. Then, Elijah was already complete when you met him. He didn't need you to become who he is. The healing, the compassion, the strength. That came from how he was raised, not from biology. So he would have been better off. I didn't say that. Caroline turned to look at him. What I'm saying is that your presence or absence wasn't going to change who he fundamentally is. But knowing you, really knowing you, has given him something he didn't have before. What? Context. Caroline said simply. He spent his whole childhood imagining who you were. Some of those imaginings were angry. Some were sad. All of them were incomplete. Meeting you, watching you change, building something real with you. That gave him a complete picture. It let him stop wondering and start knowing. Is that better? It's different. Caroline smiled slightly. And I think, for Elijah, different is better. He's not carrying unanswered questions anymore. He's not filling gaps with imagination. He knows who his father is, and more importantly, he knows who his father is becoming. Nathan absorbed this. What about you? Is knowing me again better for you? Caroline was quiet for a long time. I thought I had made peace with who you were. She finally said. The version of you I remembered. Ambitious, selfish, unable to see beyond your own goals. I forgave that version years ago because carrying anger was too heavy. And now I see that person was incomplete too. You were also capable of change, of growth, of showing up. I didn't know that about you. Learning it has been surprising. Good surprising or bad surprising? Caroline laughed softly. Mostly good. Although it would have been easier, in some ways, if you had stayed the person I remembered. Then I could have been right about you forever. I'm sorry for complicating your narrative. You should be. She was teasing now, Nathan realized. Actually teasing him, the way friends do when they've known each other long enough to be comfortable. I had you all figured out, and then you had to go and become someone different. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the last light fade from the sky. I loved you once, Caroline said quietly. A long time ago. I don't love you that way anymore. Too much time has passed. But I think I love who you're becoming. Does that make sense? It makes sense. Nathan replied. I feel the same way. About myself. She laughed, genuine and warm, and Nathan realized it was the first time he had ever made her laugh as an adult. All those phone calls and dinners and graduations and weddings, and this was the moment when something finally shifted. Not into romance. That door had closed decades ago and neither wanted to reopen it. But into something else. Partnership, maybe. Alliance. The comfortable familiarity of people who had survived something terrible together and come out the other side. Nathan thought about the man he had been at 28. Terrified of commitment, obsessed with success, convinced that wealth would protect him from the poverty and uncertainty of his childhood. That man would not recognize the person sitting on this porch, holding coffee that cost $2, living in a house worth less than his former wine collection. That man would have called this failure. Nathan called it life. Finally. After 55 years. He was actually living it. When Elijah's daughter Rose took her first steps, Nathan was there. When Grace had their second child, a boy named Marcus after Caroline's father, Nathan held him within hours of his birth. When Caroline's clinic expanded to a second location, Nathan did the administrative work to make it happen, not as a donor seeking recognition, but as a volunteer who had become essential to operations. Small moments, accumulated over years, building something that couldn't be measured by net worth or market position. Building a family. Not the family Nathan had been born into, though he thought often of his parents, who had wanted so much more for him than wealth. Not the family he had created and abandoned, though that wound would never fully heal. A new family. Constructed from the rubble of his failures. Built through presence and persistence and the slow, difficult work of showing up. On his 60th birthday, Elijah took him to dinner at Maria's, the same diner where they had first really talked. The vinyl booths were worn now, the laminated menus unchanged after decades. Nathan ordered the same thing he always did, and the waitress knew his name. "I've been thinking about what to get you," Elijah said. "For your birthday. It's hard to buy presents for someone who used to have everything." "I don't need anything." "I know." Elijah reached into his jacket pocket. "But I wanted to give you something anyway." He handed Nathan an envelope. Inside was a single photograph. It showed Nathan at Rose's 3rd birthday party, surrounded by children and chaos, frosting smeared on his shirt, laughing at something off camera. He looked nothing like the polished executive who had once graced magazine covers. He looked, Nathan realized, happy. "Mom took it," Elijah explained. "She's been documenting things. Like she did when I was growing up. She said you deserved your own record now." Nathan stared at the photograph, at the evidence of the life he had built from nothing. "There's something else." Elijah's voice was quiet. "Rose has been asking about what to call you. She knows you're her grandfather, but Grandpa Nathan feels too formal, and she's been workshopping alternatives." "What did she come up with?" "She wanted me to ask if she could call you Papa. Like Caroline's father was to me, even though I never met him. Someone who matters. Someone who belongs." Nathan felt tears sliding down his cheeks, not bothering to hide them. "Papa is good." He managed. "Papa is perfect." Elijah smiled, and Nathan saw in that smile everything he had almost lost and somehow managed to find. That night, alone in his small Evanston house, Nathan sat with a photograph and thought about the man he had been. Nathaniel Ashford. Founder and CEO. Forbes list regular. Master of the universe. That man had died, slowly, over the past 7 years. In his place was someone Nathan was still learning to recognize. Papa, to a 3-year-old girl who had never known him as anything else. Volunteer, at a clinic that served people who would never be able to repay him. Friend, to a woman he had once loved and abandoned and somehow been forgiven by. Father, imperfectly and incompletely, but genuinely and consistently, to a son who had every reason to reject him. He thought about what he would tell that 28-year-old version of himself, if he could go back. Don't leave. Stay. Choose love over ambition. Choose presence over success. But he knew, with the clarity that comes from decades of reflection, that the young Nathan wouldn't have listened. Wouldn't have been capable of listening. The fear was too strong, the hunger too desperate. He had needed to build his empire and watch it fail to satisfy him. He had needed to lose everything that mattered before he could recognize what mattered. Some lessons can only be learned through loss. The photograph sat on his nightstand now, next to the clock and the lamp and the book Caroline had lent him last month. It was the first thing he saw every morning and the last thing he saw every night. Evidence of redemption. Proof of change. A reminder that it was never too late to become someone worth being. Nathan Ashford had spent 30 years building a fortune and 5 years building a family. The fortune had been impressive. The family was everything. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear that second chances are possible. Subscribe to Tales of Desire with Mr. Walker for more stories that remind us what truly matters in this life. Because sometimes our greatest failures become our greatest teachers. Sometimes the family we build is more precious than the one we're born into. And sometimes, if we're very lucky and very determined, we get the chance to prove that we can become better than our worst moments. That we can show up. That we can stay. That we can finally, after all the years of running, learn what it means to come home.